name's Eric Cohn. I'm the chapter leader for America's Future Foundation here in Chicago. Did anything important happen today, or no? So I imagine we might get into some of that, especially Janice fee AFSCME being decided today, because I'm sure, as Adam could tell you, there probably is a connection to the budget. So we have a lot to talk about, and we're really excited. But before we get to that, I want to tell you a little bit about America's Future Foundation, what we do, and why we're here. We're an organization that is dedicated to cultivating the next generation of classical liberal leaders here in Chicago. We host events like this, usually once a month, that are discussions on philosophy or public policy. Sometimes individual speakers, sometimes debates, and we usually have a pretty good time, I think most people would agree. So if you want to find out more, you can go to americasfuture.org, or you can sign up for our email list, and you can come talk to me if you're not already on it, and we can get you on that list. We're going to have a lot of exciting events coming up throughout the rest of the year. We're working on the rest of our calendar, but we're actually hoping to have, and I believe we should have, a conversation with Rayhan Salam from National Review, who has a book coming out about basically an immigrant's case against expanded immigration. So I think that should be an interesting topic to discuss, given what's in the news now. But we have a lot of interesting programming coming up, and we want you to know about that. So please sign up for our email list. You can do that at americasfuture.org. The topic for tonight's discussion is the secret lies of Illinois' budget. If you've lived in Illinois just recently, or if you're like me and have lived here most of your life, you probably know that the state is a fiscal mess. It's not in the best of condition, and one of the reasons for that is the nature of our budget. They just passed a budget. Some people are touting it as a balanced budget. Other people say, well, okay, that's not exactly true. So we wanted to give you an insight into the nature of the current budget, the budget process, and how we got here as a function of really the system in Illinois. Before I bring on our speaker, I want to note one thing, that America's Future Foundation is a 501c3 organization. We do not advocate for candidates or for legislation. We're simply an educational issue group. So just that disclosure at the beginning here. And without any further ado, I want to bring up Adam Schuster, who is the Director of Budget and Tax Research at the Illinois Policy Institute. Adam, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, so first of all, thanks for everybody for coming out. I am both flattered and encouraged that there are this many people interested in the Illinois budget. Some of the topics I'm going to cover today are the recently passed spending plan. I try not to call it a budget because it's not, as well as why we keep being such an outlier on budget and tax issues, and finally why you shouldn't jump ship and flee the state like so many people have done, because there is some light at the end of the tunnel. So that said, there's a lot to cover. I'm going to do my best to distill it down to 15 to 20 minutes or so. But because that's not enough time to cover these topics perfectly, I ask you to think critically about what I'm going to say, to challenge myself in your own mind, and then at the end of the talk to please ask questions that push back on things you don't agree with or that you have concerns about. So like I said, the recently passed bill, HB 109, is not a budget, it is a spending plan. And you'll see many politicians from both the right and the left claiming the opposite, that this is the first time we've had a balanced budget. Some will say since Governor Rauner's been elected, some will say since, in 2 decades, depending on which side of the aisle they're sitting on. And I'm giving you what I think is the truth. And that's that this is not balanced, it's an unfunded spending plan. And for what it's worth, all 3 credit rating agencies, that's Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, have now come out and said that this is not a structurally balanced plan, that it does nothing to solve the state's long-run challenges. So S&P in particular called this a status quo budget, or a return to the status quo. And I think that's essentially the perfect way to sum up what just happened, because we've returned to the status quo of budget making or of fiscal policy in this state, which is essentially gimmicks that make the budget appear balanced on paper, but don't really do anything to solve the state's challenges. And we keep digging ourselves deeper and deeper into a fiscal hole, and it gets harder to get out every year. So the lawmakers who believe they deserve congratulations for this, and who are touting this bipartisan accomplishment, are essentially asking you to thank them for doing the most fundamental and basic part of their job and not even doing it well. And the reason they didn't do it well is because this budget overspends by between $635 million and $1.5 billion. And the reason the range is so large, I'll get into, it has a lot to do with sort of the speculative gimmicks that they're using. But the top line spending in the general funds budget this year is $38.5 billion. Now, there's two agencies that are supposed to estimate revenue for the coming year. There's one legislative called COGFA, stands for Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability. I'll just call it COGFA for ease. And then there's an executive agency that's called the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. Now, both of these agencies are supposed to come out with an estimate for how much money we're going to have next year. It's a basic first step of budgeting. And then the legislature, by statute and constitutional requirement, is then supposed to adopt their own official estimate that says this is how much we're going to have, right? This is how everybody does budgeting around the kitchen table. You first decide how much money you're going to bring in, and then you prioritize within that limit. So Democratic Attorney General Lisa Madigan said that revenue estimates create a ceiling beyond which spending may not go. Now, the first thing you need to know about this spending plan is that they never adopted a revenue estimate. And without a revenue estimate, I cannot call this a budget. But there are revenue estimates that come out of these two agencies that sort of inform the legislature, right? And the revenue estimate from the legislative agency, from COGFA, is $37,635 million. Okay, so it's just some quick math. You can already see that that top line number is about $635 million lower than what they're planning to spend. Okay? Now, on top of that, that original revenue estimate included about $600 million in interfund borrowing, as well as $300 million from selling the James R. Thompson Center, which is the third year in a row that they've included revenue from the sale of that building. Okay, so real basic math, if they've included that revenue 2 years prior and it never came, that's already a $600 million deficit from those 2 prior years, right? So they're now including that $300 million again as a positive on their books, and this is essentially phony accounting. So if you take away the $900 million in fake money that's not really revenue, this budget overspends by $1.5 billion. So you might be asking at this point, well, the Illinois Constitution requires a balanced budget. Well, we haven't had a balanced budget since 2001. When the end of year cash balance is totaled up, the last time money coming in exceeded money going out was 2001. So how is that possible? Well, I'll get into a little bit later why the balanced budget requirement we have has no teeth, but essentially what they do is they use a bunch of gimmicks that are very common. They use a lot of the same gimmicks every year, but are very deceptive to make things look balanced on paper at the beginning of the year when they know that it's not going to pan out in the end of the year. So this year, they increased the originally planned $600 million in interfund borrowing to $800 million in interfund borrowing. They included $300 million from the sale of the James R. Thompson Center. They ignored $412 million of back pay that's owed to government workers as a result of a contract dispute between Governor Rauner and AFSCME, which is the largest state of Illinois union. And they're counting on about $422 million in speculative pension savings. So those pension savings are based on a good policy. It's called a pension buyout. And essentially the way that works is if you're a person who's vested in the pension system but inactive, you have an option to buy out your pension for 70% of the net value. And if you're, for 60% of the net value. And if you're a vested member who's close to retirement, you have an option to buy out your COLA, which is your future cost of living adjustments, at 70% of the future value. And I know that's a lot of numbers, it's very complicated, but essentially what they're doing is they're counting on people to cut their own pensions. Okay? And there are some reasons why that might make sense, right? There are some circumstances where it makes sense for an individual to do that. In Missouri, this was actually a very successful policy. About 22% of the participants took this pension buyout plan. However, Missouri does not have the same sort of constitutional protections for pensions that we do, and they also don't have as generous of benefits to begin with. So what Illinois did is we counted on that 22% uptake rate, that 22% of people are going to voluntarily cut their own pensions, and we said that's going to save us about $422 million. that's a guess. It's a made-up number, okay? The interfund borrowing, the $800 million, it either has to be paid back to those other funds. This is borrowing from other state funds that aren't part of the general revenue fund, or it creates a deficit in those funds. So either way, this is a deficit. It's pushing a deficit out into the future years. One example, so Illinois has about 600 special state funds, and one example of the fund they borrowed from is called the Mental Health Fund. So that's a fund that is funded by people who have mental health services through the state, and it's supposed to be used, the spending's supposed to be used only to pay for increases in mental health services, okay? So it's a self-funded fund. It doesn't take tax dollars, okay? It's productive, which is rare for government, okay? And they took about $1.1 million out of that fund last year. So that's just one example of the type of interfund borrowing they do. And essentially what that is it's a crutch to hide their overspending, to hide the fact that they're not bringing in enough revenue to pay for all the promises that they've made. So the other problem with this budget, aside from, with the spending plan, I slip sometimes, so correct me if I do that, but the other problem with this spending plan is the process by which it was passed. So the substance is terrible. The process by which it was passed is terrible. This 1,245-page bill was introduced about 5 hours before the Senate voted on it. There was no opportunity for public comment, and most of the lawmakers who voted on it had no idea what was in it. Okay? It was negotiated by a select group of sort of elite legislators, while your sort of common rank and file legislator was sort of told how to vote or voted for political reasons. One example of the fact that they don't know what's in it, I had legislators asking me about the money for the Obama Presidential Center. Okay, so the Obama Presidential Center, essentially the state's spending a bunch of money on infrastructure improvements to allow the construction of a presidential center honoring Obama. And nobody could agree on how much money was in the budget for that. The reason is because the word Obama or presidential library or presidential center does not appear anywhere in the budget. Okay, so you have to sort of figure out what these sort of very vague line items are and where the money's coming from for this grant. So the initial reporting was that it's $172 million, then the newspapers changed that to say, no, it's actually $180 million, and then they figured out that it's actually about $224 million. Okay, so they can't even figure out what they're spending money on. All right, and that's the sort of lack of transparency we have. And I've said that in the past, in sort of media appearances, things like that, and the pushback I get, well, yeah, but isn't that just the way we do budgets in Illinois? And I say, yes, and that's the problem. This is nothing new, okay? This has been going on for decades, and it's emblematic of what is a broken budget process, and it's the reason that Illinois is a national laughingstock on budget and tax issues. It's the reason that we went over 2 years, 736 days, without enacting a full year's budget. It's the reason that we set a record in United States history for the longest a state's ever gone without a budget. It's the reason we have increasing tax burdens when all 6 of our neighboring states are reducing their tax burdens. And that's the reason why our economy is suffering, and that's the reason why we're driving people out of the state. We have 4 years in a row of a declining population. There's only one other state in the country who has that. Okay? So what I did is I looked at these problems. Okay, these are facts. We know we have these problems. Why do we have them? It's very easy to blame Illinois politicians, and they certainly deserve a lot of the blame, and I mean a lot of the blame, because they're completely fiscally irresponsible. They care way more about their next election than they do about the long-term fiscal health of the state. But then that begs the question, are they different substantively from politicians in other states? And ultimately I have to say, to some degree maybe, but there are fiscally irresponsible politicians in every state. So why are we an outlier? And I believe the answer lies in the budget process itself. So there's 4 key things I'm going to talk about that Illinois does differently. And this is based on a review of literature of economics, public policy, finance, public administration, and sort of what best practices are for public finance. And the first thing we do badly is our revenue estimates. I talked about that a little bit earlier. So one of the problems is that we don't have any process, any guaranteed process for producing accurate revenue estimates. Some states require the executive branch and legislative branch to work together and come up with one number. But the actual best way of doing this is you have an executive estimate and a legislative estimate, and you take an average of the two, and that's your estimate for the year. And the reason that's better is because it sort of averages out the biases that each branch has. So, if Republicans control the governor's office and Democrats control the legislature, one branch may want to underestimate revenues to say we need more, and the other branch may want to overestimate them to say no, we don't need a tax hike. And when you average them out, you kind of come into a more accurate number in between. In Illinois, we don't have any process for averaging, and lawmakers have so far been able to flout the requirements that we do have, that they pass a revenue estimate to begin with. We actually have not had a revenue estimate since 2014. So think about that. That means for the last 4 years now, lawmakers have been planning how to spend your money without agreeing ahead of time how much of it they have. Imagine doing that at home, right? Essentially what they're doing is they're creating a wish list of items they'd like to spend money on, and then they're saying, well, this is how much we have, and anything that we can't cover in our promises, we're just going to put it on a high interest credit card. And that's why our credit rating is the lowest in the nation. Okay? The second problem with the Illinois budget process is that we have really poor savings habits and really poor taxing habits, and that makes us vulnerable to recession. So just about every state has what's called a rainy day fund or a budget stabilization fund, and it's, again, to analogize to your personal finances, you might put money aside in a savings account to plan for unexpected medical expenses or a car accident, or for something you're not planning that's going to put a big hole in your monthly or annual budgets. States are supposed to do that as well, and best practices say you're supposed to have about 5% of your annual revenues or your annual expenditures put aside, and mostly that's to offset recessions, so that you don't need to do drastic spending cuts or drastic tax increases when there's a recession. So 5% for this fiscal year in Illinois would be about $1.9 billion. Would anybody like to guess how much Illinois has? We have about $98,000, okay, which is essentially zero. It's enough money to cover 81 seconds of state spending, okay? So we have nothing. Now, last year when they passed the spending plan with the tax increase over Governor Rauner's veto, they swept all the remaining money out of that fund other than this $98,000, and they changed the law so that they didn't have to repay that money. But this has been going on since way before last year. So I looked at the last 15 years or so, all 50 states, and figured out how much money each state has put aside for their rainy day fund. Illinois ranks 45th out of 50 states. We save less than 1% on average. And the only states that are below us are states that have not had a rainy day fund for that entire period of time. So essentially, we've never funded this appropriately, and the reason for that is because we treat it like any other fund. So, say you have a 401k account, right? There's penalties for taking money out of that, right? There's tax penalties, and it's something you're only going to do in a true emergency. Most states have something approximating that for their rainy day fund. It requires a supermajority of legislators to take money out of that fund, and they also tend to have statutory requirements for deposits into that fund. And so what that means is you can't raid the piggy bank every year. In Illinois, it's a simple appropriation. You can treat it like any other fund, so they do raid the piggy bank every year, and that's why we don't have enough savings. The other part that makes us vulnerable to recession is our tax portfolio. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, so I'm going to summarize it real quickly. But essentially, some taxes are more volatile than others. They're more elastic than others, meaning they're more vulnerable to economic shock. So the way I like to put this is, take gasoline tax. Gasoline tax is very stable because no matter what's happening in the economy, people need to consume about the same amount of gasoline. Interestingly enough, another one that's very stable is alcohol, because it turns out people are going to buy alcohol no matter how the economy is doing. And when you rank sort of the largest tax sources, it basically goes, the most volatile is corporate income tax, followed by personal income tax, and sales tax is the most stable. And the fewer exemptions you have in your sales tax, the more stable it is. Illinois, over time, has been relying more and more on the volatile revenue sources. Since 2011, we've been relying more and more on personal and corporate income taxes and less on the stable ones. So when you take the volatility of our tax structure combined with our lack of savings, what that means is if there's another recession, we're screwed. Okay, it's going to take, you think our problems are bad now. If there's another recession and there's a big dip in any of those tax sources, it's going to require drastic cuts or drastic tax increases, which will cripple the economy even further, which is a very bad thing to do in a recession. And the reason why all of these problems are happening is because our state spending is growing faster than residents' personal income. So I was on a television station in Chicago tonight the other day talking to someone else who's touted as a budget and tax expert, and I pointed out that state spending has been growing 25% faster than residents' personal income. And he said, well, that's irrelevant. Okay. The reason that's not irrelevant is personal income, okay, is the way in which we fund our government. Okay. Every dollar the government has comes out of the personal economy, comes out of a taxpayer's pocket somewhere. So if state spending grows faster than personal income, that means all they can do, it means a stable rate of taxation cannot fund the government. It means their only options are to borrow money or to hike taxes. And borrowing money is essentially a future tax hike because the bill comes due eventually. Now, to prop up that overspending, they do what they did this year. They sweep money out of other state funds. They take money out of productive funds and throw it into the black hole that is the general fund's budget. They've done that in all but 5 of the last 15 years. And the other problem with this, besides being a crutch, is that it hides the state's overspending from taxpayers and from bondholders. Essentially, it's kicking the can down the road because they have to repay this money or it creates deficits in other places in the state government. Okay, so things sound pretty bad right now. We have the lowest credit rating in the nation. We're the only state in the region hiking taxes. People are leaving. They're getting out of here because they're going to places where their personal finances are going to be better due to the tax situation. So why am I saying you shouldn't leave? It's a good question. There's a few things. First is these problems are all solvable. Okay, the public policy solutions actually aren't difficult. The first thing we need to do is we need to institute a constitutional spending cap. About 25 states have one right now, and that ranges from liberal California to conservative Texas to swing states like Ohio and conservative Tennessee as well. And so it's not a partisan solution, it's not an ideological solution. What a spending cap does is it ties growth in state spending to some sort of metric. And the most effective ones tie it to growth in personal income or per capita GDP. Because what that means is it ties lawmakers' ability to spend your money to your ability to pay the bill. And we actually got some great bipartisan support for that amendment this year. We got Democratic Senator Tom Collerton, Republican Mike Connolly, as well as a bunch of other Republican and Democratic co-sponsors in the Senate. And we can build on that momentum going forward to encourage them to adopt a constitutional amendment that will make sure state spending doesn't grow faster in the future than what we can afford. The second reason I think you should be optimistic is because of the Supreme Court decision today, Janus versus AFSCME. When you look at where state spending has grown, there's two things that stick out. Pension payments have grown by about 663%, and public employee health care costs have grown by 215%. All other state spending has grown by about 16%. So pretty clear where the growth is. And Moody's Investor Services, which is one of the leading credit rating agencies, said today that they view Janus versus AFSCME as a credit positive for public finances because it will change the way that governments decide on public employee compensation and benefits. So when you add those things up, I think what we have is essentially a problem of political will. The problems themselves are easy to solve. We know where the problems are. And if we have enough support from taxpayers, enough support from the average Illinoisan, we can put pressure on lawmakers to turn the state around. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Adam. We do have some time for question and answer. Before we get to that, I just want to give a friendly reminder to everyone that questions have this nice little quality of ending in a question mark. And you're all lovely people. I'm sure you have interesting life stories. We can talk about them later. You can just get right to your question and try to avoid the "Do you agree with me?" question. I do that all the time, so I'll blame myself on that one. I'm a perpetrator of that as well. So if you have any questions, I'm going to come around with the microphone. Just raise your hand, and I will come to you. We'll come to you back here.
Okay, so given that many of our problems stem from legislators being unwilling to follow the rules that they wrote for themselves, right? And that ability to disregard the rules, what's the solution here? I mean, obviously one is voting them out of office. Given that hasn't happened in the last decade, is it a stronger balanced budget amendment? They won't follow the rules, so I don't see how rules.
Sure. So our rules are bad, is the answer. About 37 states plus Puerto Rico require end-of-year balance for their balanced budget requirements, and so which is what anybody who talks about balanced budgets thinks intuitively balanced budgets means. And what that means is at the end of the year, you can't carry your deficit over, okay? So it means the end of your balance has to be either zero or positive. So 37 states plus Puerto Rico have that. And the expert literature on the subject shows that those balanced budget requirements are actually very effective at restraining lawmakers' fiscal decision making. What Illinois has is a prospective balanced budget requirement, which essentially means during the appropriations process, when they pass the bill, it has to say that it equals out. That's all it says. So that's how they're able to get away with these sorts of gimmicks that I talked about earlier, is because the balanced budget requirement's toothless. It doesn't actually require a balanced budget, it just requires them to say it's a balanced budget. So that's why we haven't had a balanced budget since 2001. So my argument is that requiring end-of-year balance, saying that they can't count on borrowing or refinancing or fund sweeps as revenue, saying that they have to cap their spending to the growth in the personal economy. Those are the things that we can do to make our rules more effective so that we can restrain fiscally irresponsible decision making.
Yeah. Do you have any suggested cuts we should make to the budget as opposed to focusing on the revenue side?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you have any suggested cuts?
Yes. So I think there were a lot of good solutions, a lot of good starts in the governor's proposed budget this year. None of those eventually ended up making the enacted budget, but I'll give you a few examples. So one would be to align pension costs so that the person who pays the bill is the person who incurs the cost. So Illinois is one of the few states where the state picks up the cost of local pensions. And so
That's like school districts, right?
school districts, universities, and essentially what that means is local employers like school districts have, which is 2/3 of your property tax bill, have no incentive to control the rise in pension costs because they don't pay it. So they can promise benefits, and a lot of times what you see them do is they'll trade things off, right? So the union wants salary increases. They pay that. So they'll say, well, no, we can't give you salary increases, but we can give you these increased pension benefits. And the reason they're able to do that is because they can get away with it in their budget because they do pay the salary, but they don't pay the pensions. So that's one example. And if you did it all at once, if you shifted it back all at once, it'd save about $1 billion. The governor had suggested doing it over the course of 4 years, so it's a little bit easier for them to bear the burden, 25% each year. That's one example. Another example would be asking public employees to pay a similar percentage of their own health care costs as what's paid in the private sector. So right now they get platinum level health insurance at bronze level prices. They only pay 23% of their, on average, they pay 23% of their total health care costs. The governor's contract suggested increasing that to about 40%, which is about what your average public sector worker pays for their own health care. And they've been fighting that. And that's one area where Janus versus AFSCME could help in the long run. So I think ultimately what you need to do, whether it's pensions, healthcare, administrative bloat, is you need to look at what are the largest places we spend money on, and how can we reduce that? So it's going after the cost drivers. A lot of what you see in budget negotiations is sort of tinkering around the edges. They come up with these phony gimmicks to save spending, or they go after things that really don't take up a large share of the budget, like social services, which most people actually support the government spending money on.
Do you think there's any possibility that the constitutional protections for pensions will be repealed? And if so, will that change anything?
That would change things massively. Okay, so I'm currently working on some research, and I'll just preview it a little bit for you here. But the pension reform passed under Governor Quinn, which, by the way, was sponsored by Mike Madigan in the House and John Cullerton in the Senate, would have more or less wiped out our unfunded pension liability, and it did so without affecting any currently earned benefits. So the only benefits it affected were future benefits. The growth in your pension, people who aren't close to retirement, what their retirement age is, and the maximum payout in pension benefits. There are other states, I think Ohio is one of them, who have done similar reforms, and it's worked out for them. The Illinois Supreme Court said not only does our Constitution protect already earned benefits, from the day you're hired, it protects all future growth in those benefits, which is just an absurd stance to take, and it's budget busting, and it's completely unsustainable for the state. When you look at why our credit rating is the lowest in the nation, it's mostly because of pensions. That's across all three ratings agencies. So I think it needs to change. Whether it will change is obviously an open question, but I do think it's encouraging that we've seen from the other side of the aisle, Madigan, Cullerton, Democratic Governor Quinn, that they realized the financial reality at one time at least, and maybe all we need to do is wake them back up to that because it's staring them in the face. So, yeah.
I feel like Phil Donahue for like the four people who aren't too young to get that joke.
Related question, given the constraint of the constitutional protection for pensions, is there any pathway to fix, was it $100 billion funding gap? Can it be fixed without repealing that protection?
So how much we're in debt on pensions is an open question as well. It depends a lot on the time span you look at it, as well as the investment assumptions you make. The state officially reports about $131 billion in pension liabilities. Moody's Investor Services says it's actually closer to $250 billion, which is a pretty big gap. And it just depends a lot on the assumptions. But I think first of all, we need to change that. We need to change the constitutional protection. And I think we can do it in a way that still protects earned benefits, but leaves future benefits open to change. And secondly, there are things we can do before that to start fixing the problem now. So one of those is properly aligning pension costs with the local governments. That doesn't require a change to the Constitution. Essentially, all we'd be doing is, someone else says this in a different context, but essentially it'd be asking everyone to pay their fair share. You incur the cost of those pensions, you pay the bill, and we don't need the Constitution to change to do that. We don't need the Constitution to change to right-size public employee health costs with what people receive in the private sector. So there's things we can do now to ease the pressure, but long-term, I think we do need to change the Constitution.
We just went the opposite direction, right? We just have the state cover all the districts recently.
So actually, I will say one upside to the recently enacted spending plan is, I said most of the pension savings are speculative. They're counting on about $444 million of pension savings. I say $422 million are speculative. The $22 million gap is tighter restrictions on pension spiking. And so what that means is if you increase end-of-year salaries above a certain percentage, you have to pay the cost of that. It used to be 6%, so in the last 4 years, if you hiked a teacher's salary by more than 6%, you had to pay the bill. They reduced that to 3%. So in some ways, that's actually a partial cost shift or a partial realignment of costs back to the local districts, and that $22 million seems to be solid, so we can count on that. Oh, back there, okay.
So the only solution I see is IRAs on new employees to start a complete phase out of this. I think I'm the only one in Illinois who talks about this daily. Why is there no push for that? And also, I would refer to these as deferred wages. They're promising future wages with no idea how to budget this. You can't buy votes unless you have deferred wages. How do we get around that as far as buying votes? Because that's what it's all about.
Well, I'll answer the first part of the question. So as far as buying votes, I don't want to get it's a little bit political, but as far as personal pension accounts, whether it's an IRA or 401k style account, I think the Illinois Policy Institute has been a strong advocate of that in the past. I think it's certainly a good solution. They're more predictable, and if I was still a state employee, which I was previously, I would not want to put my retirement security in the hands of politicians because they've consistently shown that they're terrible at defending my retirement security. So I think that's a win-win for both sides. And as far as moving future workers into personal retirement accounts, that doesn't do anything to touch the current unfunded liability, though. So.
I want to start less people today.
Well, it stops the bleeding. It stops it from getting worse. But we still have 130 billion or 250 billion in debt to people currently in the system that we need to deal with. And that number is based on projecting the future increase in those benefits. So if we can curb the line on that future increase, we can get rid of that debt without affecting anyone's earned benefits. So one thing I think is very important to say is people are very worried. You're coming after my pension. My aunt is a teacher, okay, and she heard me talking on TV, and she sort of jokingly said to me, "Why do you want to take my pension?" I was like, "I don't. Anything you've earned, anything you're currently receiving, absolutely should be protected." I do agree that's a promise. However, when we're talking about how fast those benefits grow in the future, we need to ask whether taxpayers can afford the growth. And so what I'm talking about is going after the growth.
To your point about not wanting to put your trust in politicians for your retirement security, you could add to that the point that of the 5 major pension systems in the state of Illinois, the one that is the most underfunded, in the worst shape, is the retirement system for state legislators when they retire. They can't adequately plan for their own retirement. Why should anyone expect them to plan for theirs?
Well, yeah, I'll just add to it anyway. I think that
Said I was playing Phil Donahue.
one thing they should do is lead by example. I think there are a lot of members elected who have voluntarily opted out of the system, the General Assembly retirement system, but they should blow the whole thing up and get rid of it, because if they're going to ask, your average state worker to move to a personal retirement account, they should show that they're willing to do that as well.
Would have been better if I was more exasperated like Donahue usually is.
Are there any geographic limits on pensions? For instance, to be a CPS teacher, you have to live within the city. In order to get a state pension or a city pension, do you have to live within the city or state? Because I know a decent amount of people who are public sector workers at retirement age, they then leave the state because their dollar goes farther.
Yeah, not once you're working. Not once you're retired, rather. While you're working, obviously you need to be where you're working. But people absolutely can take their pensions and move to Florida, and then Illinois is paying their income without any tax, because Illinois has no tax on retirement income, which is a good thing. We want less taxes, not more. But they're then spending all their money in the Florida economy rather than the Illinois economy.
Could there be a provision of, to get your Illinois or city pension, you have to reside within it, just like if you want to be employed by the municipality, you have to be within the municipality?
I mean, I'm not a big fan of restrictions on where people can live, but I think there's things we can do to address the problem without that, I guess. So.
Hi. How would you address people who say that your thoughts are more idealistic, and then that what you call a spending plan was actually a budget to some people because they thought it was the best they could do at the time?
Yeah, so whether it's the best they could do and whether it's good is not the same question, right? I think a lot of people are presenting a false choice that our options were no budget or a bad budget, pick one. And I think there's some truth to that because of our rigged process, because The Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan, has such absurd control over the House rules because they have a supermajority in the Senate and near a supermajority in the House. I do think reform-minded politicians are at a disadvantage in budget negotiations. I just think it's the wrong question, right? It's not what could they have done with the bad people in power, it's what should they have done, right? I mean, and that's what we need to educate people on.
Yep, excellent presentation. A question I have is that, well, we have these general elections coming up in early November, and then after that we go into a lame duck legislative session. Do you think there's a possibility of there being some tax hikes trying to be brought up during the lame duck session?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. So Fitch Ratings has said that they think lawmakers and the governor may need to revisit the spending plan as early as this fall because it's not actually balanced. And because it's not actually balanced, they'll either need to cut some spending or they'll need to hike taxes. Now, I think Fitch is wrong about this fall because I think there's politically no chance that they would touch this thing again before November. The reason they did what they did on this sort of absurd compromise budget is so that they could kick the can past the elections. But because it's unbalanced, because of all the holes in it, there's a very good chance that they will need to do a sort of a mid-year patch. We saw that in 2015, actually. So in 2014, what the legislature did is they passed a budget that assumed a full year of tax hike revenues, even though they knew the tax hike was going to expire midway through the year. So when Governor Rauner came into office in January of 2015, the first thing he had to do was grapple with that hole that the legislature created. Whoever comes into office in January, whether it's Rauner again or J.B. Pritzker, I think there's a very good chance that they'll be grappling with a mid-year hole. We need to let them know that tax hikes are not an acceptable solution to that mid-year hole should they find it. We're coming up on the anniversary. July 6th is the anniversary, one-year anniversary of last year's tax hike, which was a 32% personal income tax hike and a 33% corporate income tax hike. And despite that tax hike, they couldn't balance the budget in either of the first 2 years. They did nothing to pay down the backlog of bills, did nothing to solve the pension problem. All the rating agencies kept us at just one notch above junk. And so I think what that proves is beyond any reasonable doubt, tax hikes will never solve our problem because we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. So I think we do need to let lawmakers know that if that mid-year hole pops up, tax hikes aren't an acceptable solution.
All right, Adam Schuster, Director of Budget and Tax Research at the Illinois Policy Institute. Thank you. I want to thank everybody again for coming. I mentioned this at the last meeting, but I want to mention it again. Thank you for coming for the reason that your being here helps make this a great organization. And we are being recognized as a great organization. So as a chapter leader, I've been involved with America's Future Foundation in one way, shape, or form since 2008. I've been a chapter leader for most of the last 6 or so years. Alex Brunk, who's with us, was the chapter leader in the interim when I was in between when I was and when I have been again, and did an excellent job with this chapter. And a testament to that is once a year I go to a retreat with the other chapter leaders from around the country, and AF's national group presents 3 awards each year, which is the best new chapter, the most innovative chapter, and the chapter of the year. And the chapter of the year at our last gathering is the Chicago chapter. That is a testament to, that's not a testament to me and to Jeff Halm, who's on our board, and to Jeremy, who helped lead the chapter, has led the chapter in the past. It's a testament to all of you who come and make this such an engaging place to have these conversations, to talk about these ideas, to engage on these issues, and to contemplate what we can do to have a greater amount of freedom, to increase liberty in the future. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming and making this such a great chapter. I'm getting a sign that I should tell you what our next event is, and I don't have that yet. Otherwise, I would. But what I can tell you is this. You can go to americasfuture.org. And there you can sign up for our emails. You can find out what events that we have coming up. We are in the works on a number of exciting events. Some we've got nailed down later this year, but we definitely want you to be a part of it. So please go to americasfuture.org and sign up there. Big thanks again to Adam Schuster from the Illinois Policy Institute. Thank you again for coming. Bar will remain open until 9 o'clock, and there's food. Please help yourself. Thanks again for coming.